Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to uncover the truly fascinating historical journey of how ancient texts survived the ravages of time to become the modern printed books we rely on today. If you're a documentary lover or a history buff, you are in for an absolute treat with this one. We're going to trace a literary lifeline that stretches across millennia, surviving the collapse of empires, deliberate book burnings, and, just the simple, relentless decay of time itself.
So let's jump right into this historical mystery. When you really think about it, survival was the exception, not the rule in antiquity. Considering the inevitable natural decay of physical materials, how did texts written on easily destructible stuff, like crushed plant stems and dried animal skins, manage to survive centuries of turbulent history, wars, and shifting civilizations? Honestly, it seems almost physically impossible that any coherent documents from that era remain intact today.
Part 1. The Mystery of Ancient Survival.
To actually solve that mystery, we really have to understand the immense physical labor required to copy and preserve early writings. This wasn't just a matter of hitting save on a keyboard. It was a grueling, lifetime dedication for thousands of ancient scribes. For thousands of years, these manuscripts had to be manually reproduced, and I mean painstakingly manually. Monks and scholars would sit in freezing, dimly lit rooms working with papyrus, which was derived from the inner bark of a plant, or on parchment made of finely prepared animal skins. And get this, some of these skins were stitched together to create massive scrolls reaching up to 100 yards in length. They were rolled onto these heavy, carved wooden sticks just so they could be handled. Imagine the sheer physical burden of just carrying a 100-yard document around with you, let alone reading the thing.
Beyond just the physical weight, imagine trying to read a text with absolutely zero spacing. Seriously, there were no paragraphs, no punctuation, and no breaks between words at all. Furthermore, in the ancient Hebrew manuscripts, the text was written from right to left, entirely in consonants. Reading this wasn't just some casual evening activity. It required intense, highly specialized cognitive training to even decipher where one word ended and another began. The mental load required to accurately transcribe those deep columns without making a single error is just staggering.
Well, this incredible survival was basically made possible by hyper-dedicated groups like the Masoretes. These Hebrew scholars worked for over 4 centuries, from 450 to 900 AD, essentially acting as the ultimate quality control team for the biblical texts. They supplied the text with vowel points so the original pronunciation wouldn't be lost to history, standardized the readings, and then did something totally revolutionary. They deliberately destroyed any variant or worn-out copies. Think of this as the ultimate ancient version of version control. By systematically destroying flawed copies, they ensured that no corrupted text could survive to confuse future generations of readers.
Which brings us to Section 2, Unearthing the Oldest Manuscripts. So, how does all this ancient preservation build into the thrilling archaeological discoveries of the 19th century? For a long time, historians wondered just how far back we could trace physical copies. Well, by 1909, scholar Caspar René Gregory had cataloged an astonishing 4,070 surviving Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. To put that into perspective for us history lovers, classical works by revered philosophers like Plato or Aristotle often survive in only a handful of fragmented copies. Having over 4,000 manuscripts provided an unprecedented, massive pool of data for scholars to reconstruct the historical texts with incredible accuracy.
But the absolute crown jewels of these thousands of discoveries, that would be the Vatican and Sinaitic manuscripts. Finding these intact was a monumental leap back in time, bridging a massive historical gap that scholars previously thought was permanently lost. They date all the way back to approximately 325 AD and are written entirely in large, separated capital Greek letters known as uncials. Discovering nearly complete manuscripts of this age gives historians a breathtaking, completely uncorrupted window into exactly how these texts read over a millennium and a half ago. And the story of how these were found is honestly a genuine archaeological thriller. The priceless Sinaitic manuscript wasn't just sitting neatly filed in a modern museum somewhere waiting to be cataloged. It was literally unearthed in parts in an incredibly remote, isolated fortress at the foot of Mount Sinai, the monastery of St. Catherine. In the mid-19th century, the scholar Konstantin Tischendorf braved the harsh desert environment and rescued one of history's most important documents from absolute obscurity. He saved pages that were quite literally about to be burned as kindling. Unbelievable, right?
Moving on to Section 3, From Scrolls to the Press.
Okay, so the agonizingly slow era of hand copying finally hits a monumental turning point in the middle of the 15th century. This is where the pace of history suddenly shifts from a slow crawl to an absolute sprint. Johann Gutenberg's invention of the printing press around 1440 in Mainz, Germany, didn't just introduce a new machine, it sparked a total information revolution. Before this, remember, every single manuscript was painstakingly written by hand. The printing press made it possible to mass-produce literature, pulling knowledge out of the exclusive, tightly controlled grip of the monasteries and dropping it directly into the hands of the general public.
The chain reaction of this invention was practically overnight in historical terms. We jump from Gutenberg in 1440 straight to Erasmus publishing a widely printed Greek text in 1516, which immediately fueled William Tyndale's English translation in 1526, and that culminated in the monumental King James Version in 1611. What used to take centuries of hand copying now took mere decades. In just over a century, these historical texts moved entirely from the realm of the wealthy elite to the everyday person.
Section 4. The Heroes of Translation.
But here's the thing. Translating these texts into the vernacular languages of the public was incredibly dangerous, often deadly work. It was an act of profound rebellion. Early translators took immense, life-threatening risks to democratize information. John Wycliffe had to work in exile to produce the first English translation in the 1380s. Later, William Tyndale famously announced his rebellious intention to make the scriptures so accessible that even a simple farm boy behind a plow would know more about the text than the religious authorities. For this, Tyndale was hunted relentlessly across Europe, forced to print his text secretly in Germany, and ultimately paid with his life in 1536, strangled and burned at the stake.
So what made scholars like Tyndale and Martin Luther so controversial? Well, it was their method. They actively bypassed the traditional Latin Vulgate, which was a translation made by Jerome that had held absolute supremacy in the West for over 1,000 years. By going straight back to the oldest original languages, the raw Greek and Hebrew, they ensured absolute textual accuracy. But more importantly, this wasn't just a linguistic choice. It actively undermined the established authorities' thousand-year monopoly on truth. It totally revolutionized textual scholarship and shifted political power straight back to the individual reader.
And finally, Section 5, Shaping Modern Literature.
These heroic preservation and translation efforts ultimately left a profound, lasting legacy on global civilization. By establishing these widely printed vernacular texts, translators quite literally shaped modern communication. Because so many people were reading the exact same phrasing in Martin Luther's 1534 translation, it essentially unified regional dialects and standardized the High German language. Similarly, the 1611 Authorized King James Version laid the structural foundation for the modern English we speak today. These accessible books dramatically drove up global literacy rates, intricately tying the spread of these specific texts to the explosion of global education.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this historical effort, consider this. By 1946, these historical scriptures had been translated into 972 distinct languages and dialects. Nothing else even comes close. While most classical texts from antiquity are preserved in a single language and read only by specialized academics, the biblical text became by far the most widespread and relentlessly reproduced body of literature in human history.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to just think about the books sitting on your own shelves, or that endless ocean of information accessible on your phone right now. The democratization of all that knowledge began with scribes freezing in monasteries, explorers rescuing ancient pages from desert fires, and brilliant scholars willing to literally burn at the stake just to share a translated page. Without those incredible archaeological discoveries and ultimate human sacrifices, what would our modern access to knowledge even look like today? Thank you so much for exploring this amazing historical journey with me. Keep asking questions and keep learning.